Greetings, friends. A 55-foot tall statue of Hanuman, a Hindu deity, will be unveiled in Brampton on April 23rd of the coming year. I also learned from reading about the story that the sculptor of the statue, a man named Naresh Kumawat, has previously made statues of all the famous anti-white or anti-conservative left-wing leaders. He's made statues of Mahatma Gandhi, the Indian leader who was very influential in ending British rule in India. He's made statues of Martin Luther King, the famous civil rights leader, and civil rights is actually not a great thing. That's the regime we live under right now, which has led to diversity, equity, and inclusion and all of that really evil stuff. He's made statues of Nelson Mandela, the terrorist leader from South Africa, who was opposing the whites, of course. All I can say is that these people were not our friends, and he's making statues of people that are not friends of the West, that are not friends of whites or conservatives, or I even say Christians, even though people like Martin Luther King claimed to be Christians, they were. Now, I'm not personally a fan of statues. In Orthodoxy, we have icons, but not really statuary. It's kind of rare. Roman Catholics tend to have a lot of statuary. So they would be the ones usually that would make like a Jesus statue. The point is that I would prefer Christianity to have an overarching presence in our society. Not that I would necessarily like the aesthetics of all these statues, but I would prefer this. I would want the society to be Christian and not Hindu. And I don't think it's a problem. It's not illogical. It's not necessarily immoral that you would want the actions of your government and the legal code to reflect your religious values. This figure represents an expression of the Hindu religion, the Hindu tradition in Canada. And because it's such a large statue, it happened to spark a discussion on X, which of course I was interested in because you have on one side Indians and on the other side Canadians, or more traditional Canadians, going at it, and eventually the former calling the latter racist or bigots, predictably. So part of the lesson here is illustrating that people who think of themselves as centrists, as moderates, as people who are opposed to the woke agenda, as people who maybe voiced support for the freedom movement, these sorts of people that might seem to be on our side, well, it doesn't take much to upset them before they're calling you a racist and a bigot and accusing you of colonizing the indigenous people of Canada. But that's funny, because while the indigenous people of Canada may not like white Canadians, they're not going to like the immigrants, and that is certain, and they're not, that's including people from India, okay? The indigenous Canadians or First Nations, or whatever term you use, generally speaking, those people hate all immigrants. So you can't appeal to them to demonize the whites. As soon as, there's an excuse, these people will use the leftist anti-white toolkit, because the toolkit is so useful. The paintbrush, the chisel, the terminology, it's packed and ready to go, and they can use it at the flip of a hat, at the flip of a switch, when the going gets a little uncomfortable and they have to face cultural realities, historical realities about what these nations were that we find ourselves in, at least what they were historically, is that we find them running up against the failed experiment, or not even experiment, the deliberate destruction through multiculturalism of Western countries, of the Western peoples. Now, this statue is defended by some as being on private property and violating no laws, and therefore, what's the big problem? Well, I'm not a civic nationalist. I'm a conservative. I'm not a liberal, so I do believe that Canada is a Christian country. Therefore, we should strive towards a Christian ideal. And if you have such a visible statue, that is not good because it's an influence of a foreign religion, which is not Christian. And that is, if anything, the way of the land. It's a very simple concept. Apart from getting into a philosophical, theological argument as to which is the true religion, which obviously I would argue is Christianity. But let's say we don't have the time to get into that debate. But from just a practical standpoint of being respectful and polite, when you are a visitor in a foreign land, you adopt the ways of that people. You assimilate to the culture of that people. The fact that you chose to come to this new place that welcomed you in and provided you with work, unless you wanted to be on welfare, which is another option these days, but assuming you took that benefit to work here and to benefit from the heritage that was laid down by the older generations of Canadians in centuries past that built the roads and pioneered the societies and planted the fields and built the infrastructure for the sort of culture the society we inherited. And I'm not an old stock Canadian either. I'm white, but I'm not a Scot. The Scots were the ones who really pioneered this part of Ontario. So that's not a problem for me to recognize the primacy of the legacy of the Anglo-Scots who were here in the 18th and 19th centuries. Not at all is that a problem. We can all assimilate to that. It's not saying that, oh, you have to be racially pure or you have to be whatever, but you have to get with the picture here. If you're in a foreign land, it's basic respect and dignity. But oops, maybe that's just our own culture. Maybe that was just a Western thing or a Canadian thing to expect that foreigners might come here and then want to assimilate. Of course, many foreigners did assimilate and they can be Canadians and that's fine. But when you're erecting statues of a foreign religion, especially if it's a giant statue, I don't care if it's on private property. That should be illegal. That's the whole point. These people are trying to say, oh, well, within liberalism, it's okay. Within civic nationalism, we didn't do anything wrong. And in fact, many of us, we're against the woke people. But then look how quickly they are to call you bigots or racists. And then they say they're against woke. Well, yeah, you might not think of yourself as woke, but you're a leftist. That's what's useful about this story. How quickly you can see people turn. And it's not necessarily like a cultural group thing. This would happen within, white Canadians too. You can see how quickly they flip when things they don't like present themselves. So the thing about the legal system is that it should be changed. This should be illegal. Any self-respecting country or nation is going to proscribe foreign religions. Because if you have any concept of truth, you would want your society to be founded on the truest religion. We're not all rational thinking actors that are just going to reason on our own. If you take Christianity seriously, then the statue is just not something we need in Canada at all, and it's very disrespectful. But what could you expect? Because these people are just here colonizing you, and they think that they can do that because there was a British Empire, and therefore the colonized peoples can therefore just flood into the Anglo world. And partially there's the attitude within white society, which is like a cancer, that is like a cultural suicide attitude that we did sort of play into that. So we're to blame in allowing this to happen. But multiculturalism doesn't turn out well because you're always going to be ruled by a culture. The only question is which is the system, which is the culture. And then some of the defenders of the statue were even saying, yeah, that's right, Canada's going to be Khalistan or whatever. And you know what? I actually respect those guys more than I respect the other Indians who are saying, oh, well, it's not a big deal, we're all just getting along here and you guys are just being racist. I actually respect the ones who say, yeah, that's right, we're going to colonize you, because that's more honest. And now I point out to them, hey, well then, aren't you just proving my point? You people are really just going to replace us with your own culture. Granted, there's a million other cultures competing with you, but you're going to turn Canada into something which Canada was not before. It was not the foundation of Canada. It's going to be something. It's going to be like what it was in your country, back where you came from. That's most likely what's going to happen. Maybe you want that to happen. I can respect that if you're honest about that, because that is how history works a lot of the time. One people prospers and absorbs new territory and spreads and has influence over other peoples. And sometimes there are cycles to this, so I can respect that. But let's not be silly. The whole civic nationalist, we're not breaking any laws and it's fine. It's like, well, yeah, that's a problem, and capitalism doesn't work, and no, I'm not a communist. Like, none of that stuff, all that stuff is stupid. But it's ridiculous to think that, we have private property so you can just do something. Like, no, we live in a society by definition. But really, it's not about having an authoritarian government that was going to stamp out all this religious expression of different religions. Like, really, that's not the ideal. But I am saying there has to be a dominant attitude, such as that the will of the people would not really allow this sort of thing. And you wouldn't have seen that sort of thing in the past, because the vast majority of people were Christians, and they did happen to come from Europe. The vast majority of Canadians up until recently. But for me, as long as they can become Christians, then that can bring people together in a way that we can build a nation. If you're not going to do that, then we're not going to have a meaningful society. So it's not really about the authoritarianism, it's just that Canadians see the double standard because they can't have the John A. Macdonald statue. Because the John A. Macdonald statue, he was a Canadian icon, a founder of Canada, and the left hates him as a racist and someone who strove to keep the Chinese out of Canada for a long time and was very influential in contributing to the unification of the country. Well, his statues are vandalized, or they have to be boxed up, or they're taken away. Statues which are much smaller than this 55-foot tall demon thing, but which are often older statues and represent the old white man's world, that colonial world. So it's really the double standard here. I think that's what's really animating a lot of people, and it's a valid justification. Because as soon as you want to criticize, the religious expressions of another culture, well, then you're the racist, and you're the white bigot. But none of them can even recognize that whites are also not even permitted a voice. Like one legitimate person on the Canadian side asked the question, who is our voice then? Who exactly can speak for us? And the person said, Hitler. As if to say, if you're asking for a voice, then you're automatically like a Nazi. So they don't want to actually give you a voice. They don't think that you deserve a voice. They can't even conceive of what that would mean, that white people deserve to exist in a country of their own. No, as far as they're concerned, your countries are for all of them to just come there and do whatever they want, and even enjoy their home countries. And the fact that they have homelands where they can be with people like themselves, with their familiar way of life, but they can come to these degenerate Anglo countries and they can go to weed shops and maybe any sort of materialistic pursuits, go to Disney World and bars and consumerist things, and enjoy those nice degenerate aspects of the West and just have the funnest time, and then go back to a somewhat, in some regards, more conservative, India or whatever other country in the global South it happens to be. Go back there and be with your people, and just but the whites, they don't have to have a country of but Canada's a white country, and Toronto, and that's the other narrative there. Some were saying that there's cathedrals in Canadian cities, big cathedrals, and you're talking about, a relatively small statue of a Hindu deity being erected. the double standard here. Well, first we've discussed that if you're a conservative, then you're going to support imposing one culture over another, so we've addressed that. But hold on a second. What cathedrals are there in Canadian cities? Like, all the Anglican ones have been surrendered to being homeless shelters and being husks of anything they used to be, plastered with rainbow flags. And I can't think of any large Christian institutions that are thriving in any Canadian city, and any of the three major cities that I know of. I can't think of any major cathedral that has been built recently, because Christianity is not the dominant culture in Canada anymore. It's not. That's clearly evident, and that's another aspect of what this story shows. So again, they want to have it both ways. They want to say, they want to gloat and say, yeah, that's right, we're replacing you, which maybe that's honest. But then they want to say, oh, well, you're the majority, you're the colonizer. But hold on a second. Like, where exactly are we the majority? So maybe outside the cities in Canada? Hasta luego, amigos.